And here I am with the games again. Do you know when you play a game, a strategy game like Civilization for example, you start off pretty low, usually in the Stone Age. Then as you progress, you're building your settlement, you discover agriculture, you eventually reach the Bronze Age where you start to mine ores and turn them into weapons. But that's not the end. There's another stage by which you have to go through, one that's a lot more sophisticated and complicated than the Bronze Age. It's called the Iron Age. This will be the last video in our trilogy about the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, covering pretty much all of human history. Welcome to Vlogs and Knowledge. The Iron Age is not really an historical period, it's more of an archaeological period, and just like the Bronze Age, a lot of things happen in the Iron Age that we're not necessarily going to talk about. I really want to focus this video solely on iron and the role that it played during that era, because as we're going to see, iron is very important. But before we start, as always, let's put all this in historical context and get some background. And FYI, if you really want to understand how humans got to the Iron Age and what it took to get there, I strongly encourage you to check out my last two videos that talk about just that. But for those that haven't seen those videos, I'll just do a quick little recap. First, there was stone. Stone was easy and it was primitive. Man made stone tools, used them for the hunt, used them for agriculture, and slowly progressed through the Stone Age. Eventually, the stone tools became more sophisticated and more complex, involving other materials, like wood for example. After thousands of years, it was time for a change, and that's when man discovered metal. It all started with copper and tin. You would mine them, you would melt them together, and you would make bronze. And bronze is a lot stronger than stone, and it can also be molded, which meant that you can make a lot better tools than you could with stone. And that's the background of our story. That's kind of where we are now. But there's one little thing that has to be looked at before we continue on. It's sort of the transitioning period between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. We have to look at how the Bronze Age ended and why it ended in the first place. Just so you know what to expect, we will talk a little bit about chemistry in this episode, but don't worry, I'll keep things simple for you guys, because I suppose not many of you know about chemistry, myself included. Once again, I had so much fun researching this topic and I really learned a lot. Iron is an element and each element has different properties. Some are weaker, some are stronger, some are flexible, and some are tense. The most important thing to know when dealing with metal is its properties. You need to know what the metal is made of to sort of know what it can do. For our purposes, we're going to be looking at copper, tin, and iron and their melting points, basically the temperature that they become liquid. All three metals have different melting points which strongly affected their use and the timing of their use throughout history. Tin's melting point is the lowest of them all at 230 degrees Celsius, followed by copper at 1000 degrees Celsius, and finally iron at over 1500 degrees Celsius. Bronze, as we talked about last week, is made of copper and tin, which meant that it was the easiest to do and required the less technology. Basically, the higher the temperature, the harder it is. During the Bronze Age, although people knew about iron and were using it from time to time, the technology just wasn't at the point where iron could be smelted. Just like how we saw in last week's video that stone had to come first because it was the easiest and required the less technology, the same thing applies here with bronze and iron. The process from mining the ore in the ground to having a final product, something that you can actually use, that takes work. You see, ores found in the ground are almost never pure. They are contaminated with other elements that you wouldn't necessarily want in your final product. The last piece of information is that iron is a lot stronger than bronze, and when you combine everything, you should expect that when the technology would have reached a point where iron could be smelted as easily as bronze, that's when humans would have passed from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. This all happened around the year 1200 BC. That's when archaeologists discovered remnants that indicated the use of smelted iron. Humanity was finally ready to take on the next step in its progress, a step that would last arguably all the way up until today, because we still use a lot of iron. So iron, what is it? Well, iron is an ore that comes apparently from supernovas. A supernova is what happens when a star dies. It explodes, and the last step before its death, a star produces a lot of iron which is then spread out in the universe by the explosion. And as a result, we have a lot of iron here on Earth. Once the iron hits the earth, it mixes with what's already there. For example, iron reacts with oxygen in a process called oxidization, which produces rust. It looks ugly, but it's simply the iron molecules reacting to oxygen and turning into rust, leaving the iron to slowly decay over time. Since iron is never pure, people needed to find a way to purify it. But that's not all. Iron is also very soft. You can't really use it for a weapon. So you kind of had to mix it with something else to make it more durable into something that could be used as a weapon. And for that, there's a whole chemical process that has to happen, but don't worry, I'll keep things simple for you guys. You'll have no trouble understanding. The first thing you do is you take the iron that's been mined in nature, you put it into a furnace to be heated up. This is the first step in purifying the iron and getting rid of the unwanted elements. It's really the same process they were using for bronze a few thousand years earlier. After it has been heated up past its melting point, the elements in the iron begin to split and you're left with a pure form of iron that we call pig iron. The oxygen becomes gas and evaporates, and the other impurities turn into something that we call slag, which will be important later on. Today, with that pig iron, you can make a lot of stuff. For example, you can make steel, which is heavily used in construction. With our technologies, we can literally make thousands of steels, each with different properties to fit specific jobs in the construction industry. Like, iron is literally everywhere. Although back then, they didn't really have the technology to make steel. Like, you just couldn't make steel. It required a lot of knowledge that they just simply didn't have. Instead, what they made, arguably the best that they could at the time, was to make something called wrought iron. Wrought iron is simply taking the pig iron that we talked about in the first step and mixing it with the slag, but you're mixing it in a much smaller proportion. And this was relatively easy to do, right? Because you didn't have to go out anywhere else to get any different metals. Everything that you needed was right there from the first chemical process. Mixing an element, in our case iron, with something else produces something that we call an alloy. Wrought iron is an alloy and so is steel. And wrought iron, because it was so cheap and easy to make, went ahead and replaced bronze as the industry standard for any sort of tool, weapon, or armor. Humanity once again took a big step forward to something better. Now, wrought iron is a lot stronger than bronze, but it's weaker than steel. Steel is just really strong, especially if you mix in a lot of carbon. It becomes almost indestructible, like so much so that even researchers today, they're always innovating new ways to make steel even stronger than it already is. Wrought iron is strong, but it's also soft enough to enable blacksmiths to use a hammer, heat it up, and craft a very nice weapon. Something that you couldn't really do with steel because it was just too strong. It was the perfect sweet spot between its durability, its flexibility, and its ease of use. And really, that was all that was needed to launch the Iron Age. Wrought iron was being produced in massive quantities in Asia and Europe, and soon to be all over the world. But eventually, as technological innovations allowed better alloys to be made, like steel for example, wrought iron was slowly phased out. So that was the Iron Age. I know we talked a little bit more about chemistry than history, but honestly, I kinda liked it. That's the reason why I changed it from vlogs of history to vlogs of knowledge. I want to see where this channel can go beyond history, but at the same time, I really don't see myself making other videos than history. I just love history so much. So now here are my questions to you. What do you think about iron and its chemical process? Or what about the different alloys that you can make from iron? Or more generally, you can talk about the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age and really link them all together, as this is the last video in our trilogy. Please leave me a comment, and bonus points for you, you might get featured in next week's video as a fan of the week. As you know, and as I say at the end of every video, I haven't talked about everything, and the things that I did talk about, I haven't gone into too much detail. That's okay, that's actually done on purpose. I want you guys to go out and research on your own, and maybe learn a thing or two. With that being said, my name has been Darius Carlson, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next Wednesday.